we are.
Cheers.
I'm very pleased to welcome Barry Friedman. Barry and I have been friends for a really long time. Some of the authors I told you that I invited here, I've never met before, and some I've known forever. And Barry's in the I know forever category. What I didn't know, because it didn't matter, it didn't mean anything to me when I first met Barry, and since then he's become this really hotshot, big-time NYU law professor, is that he's a graduate of this law school. Until I saw the bio that I was reading for him last night. So here you are, a very successful academic graduate of Georgetown Law School. Back in the day when Georgetown wasn't as hot shit as it is today.
I just will say, because your administrative assistant came up to me and said something about my being a graduate, that when I went to law school here, the only building was this building. It was the ugliest building ever on the planet.
And we're actually in addition.
You're in the addition now.
To the back building. This addition didn't exist.
None of this existed. There was Kogod's. Is that the name of the liquor store?
Still there.
That's what people need, is that liquor. And here, and that was it. A lot of homeless folks, and it was kind of out here in the middle of nowhere. So
it was a war zone. So anyway, we welcome Barry, and if he's had access to your papers and read your papers, and I thought we'll start out like I always do, which is to ask him how this fits within his larger academic agenda, and how. Well, actually, first let me ask him why he decided to write it as a book. And I think he told me last night he has a surprising answer to that question, and an answer to that question that would be surprising. And then I'll ask him how it fits into his larger research agenda.
well, actually, it's the second.
Oh, okay.
But I'm going to dig in there.
You take these questions in any order you wish.
So first, thank you for having me and for reading the book and for writing such awesome comments. I actually did read them. I was presumptuous of Randy to think that I had, but I did. I thought some of them were fantastic, and I agreed. I thought some of them were terrific, and I completely disagreed. And hopefully, we'll get to talk about some of that. There are a number of threads to how this book got written, and I'm going to share the ones that are public and the ones that are much more private. So I have long cared about the Fourth Amendment and policing, taught criminal procedure, the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment course since I began teaching Lothies many years ago, more than I would care to admit. And I never have written in that space. I've written a lot about federalism, a lot about judicial review, a lot about all kinds of other things, but never wrote in that space. A series of things happened around the turn of the millennium. I was walking on a beach with some dear friends of mine from Canada, from Toronto, and we got talking about something around this space, and they turned to me. They're both lawyers. She's a prosecutor. He's gone on to make a lot of money with various business ventures, so that might be a life advice there for you if money is your goal. That they were listening to me and had never heard me be so passionate about a part of the Constitution as I was about the Fourth Amendment, which really struck me. They talked to me a lot about the Constitution. 9/11 happened, and you all, I presume, read the preface and know that that was a real motivator for me, especially Sandra Day O'Connor's groundbreaking speech where my jaw almost dropped when I heard her say that we were going to have to pull back on our liberties, and wanted to just raise my hand and say which ones, but it didn't seem like the moment. And I'm a big Sandra Day O'Connor fan. And I didn't know what to say about policing, and I was finishing another book called The Will of the People about the relationship between public opinion and Supreme Court decision making. And then two things happened. The first is that I realized that this book followed from the will of the people. That's what might surprise you, because I realized that if I thought things were off the rails around policing and around the Fourth Amendment, then the way to influence the jurisprudence was to take seriously what I had said in the will of the people and to get the public concerned about the issue. And you have to understand that I began this book in 2007. And the premise of selling the book to the publisher was that nobody cared about this issue and that they should. The publisher called me in to explain that that was a bad way to sell a book, because if nobody cared about the issue, nobody would buy the book. But they had been quite, and they actually almost passed on publishing the book, but they had become quite upset by some of the stories that I was telling, and decided that they really felt the need to tell the story. And the aha moment was that the dean, the vice dean, assigned me to teach constitutional law and criminal procedure in the same semester, which had never happened in my many years of teaching. And so I taught constitutional law and I taught criminal procedure, and by halfway through the semester I thought, what is going on? Why don't the rules that I'm teaching in con law apply in crim pro? Same constitution, same justices. They lose their mind when bad guys and the police get into the story. They lose their mind about all the doctrine, all the rules that would apply elsewhere, whether it's the democratic policing part of this, whether it's the equal protection part of this, they just all gets tossed out the window. And that's when the light bulb went off, and I realized that that's what I wanted to try to recover, was that idea. And I started to work on the book. And let me just say a couple other things, and I'll stop. One is, because I read your comments, including one I just got today, that was quite critical of my storytelling, in the sense that I was tugging at heartstrings maybe and not giving an accurate picture of policing. But Christy, who worked at the Department of Justice investigating police departments and 14141 pattern practice actions, can tell you whether my view of policing is accurate. But I knew that people needed to be persuaded. Again, none of this had happened that we see in the world today. And so I went looking for stories to get people's attention, to get them to understand why there was a problem. And I also went looking for data, which is really hard to get around policing. And I've spent a lot of time since then doing that search for data. And that led to this book. And then the last thing I think I'll tell you, which some of you may realize and some of you may not, I don't know, I don't remember if it comes, I guess it comes up in the book, which is that after Edward Snowden's disclosures, I was in a period of life of trying to figure out what to do with kind of my last chapters of my life, which sounds maudlin, but there you were. I'd done a lot of activist stuff when I was young. I'd done a lot of academic administration in the middle. And I went to the dean and said, I really want to do something different. And he said, what? I said, I realized that, God forbid this should ever be true of an academic, that the ideas in my book might have some traction in the real world. I was infuriated by the Snowden disclosures. I have complicated views about whether any given thing that the government was doing was appropriate or not. Very complicated views. But the idea that they were doing it without permission from the public was, and I was in the middle of writing this book, was crazy to me. And so we decided to start something called the Policing Project. And in the middle of setting up the Policing Project, Ferguson happened. And I now spend huge chunks of my days talking to law enforcement officials, community activists, public officials, lawyers, trying to fix some of the problems that are described in the book and to heal some of the wounds that are so omnipresent around policing. And whether we'll succeed or not is a different question, but I'm sure during our conversations I'm going to end up alluding at times to the work that's actually happening in the world.
Well, tell me about the book writing project. You've written 2 books now. Both of them are long. Each of them are long. What led you to write books in the first place, and why books and not articles, and why long books, and what the book writing process is like for you?
So I've actually written 3 books, and the third book you don't know about, but everybody in this room should, and they should. Does anybody know what the third book is? So I've written The Will of the People. I've written this book. Does anyone in this room know the other book? So I co-authored a book with John Goldberg at Harvard called Open Book about going to law school and how to do well in law school. And you should spread the word to everybody you know who's going to law school and tell them to buy the book, because then I get royalties. But actually we wrote the book because John and I felt that exam taking in particular was kind of a mystery. And I had started tutoring people about exam taking when I was a student here, and I've lectured about it for many years. So I've written 3 books, and that one's short. I don't set out to write long books, and in fact, this book is shorter than my other book, which is really long. But it does cover 200 and some years of history in meticulous detail. I think that as academics, we all need to write in a lot of registers these days. Gone is the day when you write your law review article every year and then you move on to the next law review article. As Randy knows perhaps better than any of us, you have to blog about it and you have to tweet about it and you have to get the ideas out into the world. I've gotten very frustrated with the law review process. In fact, I have an article coming out in the Duke Law Review called Fixing Law Reviews about everything I think is wrong with the law review process. I still write in the genre. It's the intellectual genre in which we write, and I write in other peer-reviewed journals and other disciplines. But I wrote a series of articles, all with the very fascinating title. I'm a whiz for titles, so they were called The History of the Counter-Majoritarian Difficulty, Part 1 through 5. And I published those articles, and people would say, you should turn it into a book. And
people would also say that he seemed to be a little touched. He had a bit of a mental derangement around the counter-majoritarian difficulty. So very, you got to move on from the counter-majoritarian difficulty. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4. How many? 5? Part 5. Very pleased. We need an intervention.
That's true. And then people wondered why it took me another, 5 years to turn those articles into a book, because in the legal world, a lot of law professors who write books just staple together their law review articles. But if you happen to have known any of those really scintillating articles, you would realize that the book is completely different than the articles.
Actually, can I interrupt you for this? I was going to ask you about this because I was thinking about articles versus books. Evan and I are finishing a draft of an article we've been working on, and they do seem to do different duty. I think I can work out problems, conceptual problems, and nail arguments down in an article, ironically, as opposed to a book. You'd think the book is where it's bigger, therefore you can do more. But with the book, in some sense, the scope has to be bigger, but that means each of the elements you can't drill down into as much because you'll lose your readers. And that's what you can do in a series of articles, on which you can then base a book that is going to rely on what you've figured out in the articles. And the book can, in that sense, be more superficial, but it can have a bigger scope.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, a lot of people ask me, and I'm sure you're privy to these kinds of conversations, should I publish this with an academic publisher or should I publish it with the trade press? And I had a lot of angst about that with the will of the people because I didn't want to dumb down the arguments. But I actually thought that writing for a broader audience, which means like 200 other people read the book that would have read it in a law review form, forced me to tell the story better. And I think what I love about the genre of books is that you can have an arc of an argument over a space. It's more of a palette. That's probably your experience too. I think that's true of your books versus your articles. You tend to write everything shorter than I do, and I admire that. I need to learn how to do that. But I love the genre.
When you get older.
Maybe. So I tell my wife, when I'll say I'm writing a book, and she'll go like, oh my God, no, because it's been a wrenching experience. So my first book, in a sense, took 15 years. My second book took 7 years. So I feel like I'm cutting it in half every time. Pretty soon I'll be writing in a week. But I do love the genre. I love to write, as I know you do. I mean, writing is the most challenging thing that I do in my life, and it's the thing I love the most. It's scary that you sit there in front of an empty screen and you have to say things, and I care a lot about words and about the way that they're said. I edit and over-edit and over-edit, and I just like the format. I'd like to figure out how to write them shorter and get wider readerships. And as I think about the next book, maybe I'll get there, maybe I won't.
So do you know what the next book is?
No, I don't. I mean, I've thought sometimes that I won't write another book. I've thought sometimes that I will write fiction, and I have a couple of fiction book ideas that I would love to try to write, but my editor at FSG who has great admiration for my writing of nonfiction, has advised me that I should stick to the non part of the genre. We talked last night about something that I have thought about, which is writing about the drug war, writing an account of the drug war, because I think people don't understand where it came from.
I propose we write this together.
Yeah, well, you proposed that we sign it together, but that I write it, or that
I said we should write this together, and then at that meeting, we have to find a third person to do the draft.
do the job. But I love the research, and I love and one of the things we talked about last night was that in this book I did something I'd never done before, which is start to interview people. And it's really fun to just get people on the phone and let them tell their stories, and then often they'll tell the story you want to tell just right out of their words.
Christy, before we dig into this, can you introduce yourself to the class?
Sure. I am a professor for practice here at the law school, and I've been here since January. Before that, I was at the Department of Justice and Civil Rights Division, and I was head of the small group of lawyers that did the pattern of practice investigations of police departments, so investigating departments like Ferguson and New Orleans and many others. And I can't remember how I met you.
I know how we met. I am the reporter for an ALI project called Principles of the Law: Policing. And ALI projects have a group of advisors, and we made a lot of phone calls to figure out who would be the right people to be advisors on this project. And it is quite a remarkable group of advisors in the sense that you have a room that runs the gamut from prosecutors, police chiefs, to NAACP, LDF, and Black Lives Matter, like all in the room together. And we have relatively civil conversations, and I think you're making progress, and that's how we first connected.
And what are you teaching here, Christy?
I am teaching a course called Transforming the Police, and we have assigned a chapter of this book. And in the spring, I will be teaching criminal procedure.
Criminal procedure? You should feel free
Criminal
to.
justice, I'm sorry.
Criminal, that is
Yeah,
criminal
right.
procedure. We're weird in this respect. I don't know if you know that, you graduated from here.
Bill Greenwald, who you don't know, taught me criminal procedure, but he was a legend here.
Christy, you should feel free to jump in if the topic turns in the direction that you want to talk about. Are you working on any writings while you're here, or just teaching?
I am working on a little bit of writing, but it's a little bit, I'm not ready to talk.
Okay. We won't talk about it. All right, so you guys, what do you want to say, ask? You all wrote papers, you all have stuff to say. Shoot. Jesse?
This mostly is in regard to your proposals with regard to stops, Terry stops. It seems to me like any proposed reform on stops that keeps them as legal would have limited impact so long as the drug laws continue to exist. Because it seems like anything can be justified by the drug laws, whether it's searches of cars because the police say, oh, we smell marijuana, or actually, well, I guess it doesn't just pertain to stops, but no knock warrants. It just seems like drugs have been the justification for the expansion of police power, and even if you try and kind of rein in that expansion, it can still be used, drugs can still be used to justify things that wouldn't, intrusions that wouldn't otherwise be okay.
And therefore, you want to know what I think about the drug laws?
Do you see your proposed reforms for stops that police specifically describe what crime they think is about to take place? Do you think that would have a large effect? Or, I mean, how do you see that working with the drug laws?
So, I'm going to take this opportunity to answer a question that I think came also from somebody else about the stops. So I'll first say I think that fixing stops is one of the hardest things to do in all of policing. I'm curious what Christy thinks, but it's a tough one. It's changeable. I mean, the NYPD is incredibly proud of the fact that they have cut their stops by over 90%, and crime continues to drop. So what was happening, there's a Yiddish word for what was happening in New York for the many years prior to the Floyd litigation, which is shanda, which means, if you don't know the Yiddish, it means it's a shameful thing that was occurring. A lot of people who were perfectly innocent were jacked up repeatedly, and I think there's no place for that kind of conduct in a society that deems itself free. But because there's an element of the Terry case in which officers will have suspicion and will approach people, it's hard to know how to fix stops. I will say, it came up last night at a FedSoc et al. Gathering, the drug laws are a real problem. And I have become certainly an abolitionist around marijuana. I think it's ridiculous that it's illegal. I have more complicated and not fully worked out views about other narcotics. I had a great conversation. I ran a forum once about this at NYU, and I asked all of the advocates what they would do, like if we legalized. And I told them far in advance that I wanted them to come prepared to explain that. Like, we all knew about all the problems. It was boring talking about them. What's the solution? And it was astonishing how meager were their answers about what to do with the problems that would happen if we moved in an abolitionist direction. But, you know, one of the things you have to understand is, you know, you could say, well, the drug laws are the problem, but in the communities that are over-policed, there are lots and lots of people. I mean, if you put a vote to those communities and said, should we, you know, legalize drugs, you'd get a lot of no. And so I don't think that the drug laws are going away anytime soon. I do think requiring officers to explain the thing that they, and I'm just teaching Terry Wednesday, so I was reading it to figure out if this is truly the case, but, you know, I think it would have a big effect to require officers to say in advance what it is that they suspect somebody of doing, and we have a way to do that now. So when the country went body camera crazy, as it certainly has, and I have a lot of skepticism about body cameras, I thought, aha, now we have a way. Officers can just say, as they approach somebody, what is the basis for approaching them? And I floated this with some police, and they're like, no, that's impossible. But there actually are departments that are starting to require that. It's not impossible at all. And I think that requiring the police ex ante to explain why they're doing what they're doing would teach us a lot about policing and probably bring under control a lot of difficulty around policing.
Jason?
I was going to ask about Terry stops as well.
Putting off that question, in a situation where, let's say, that, as you explained, the people want stop and frisk, they want a policy that might violate the Fourth Amendment, how do you reconcile that with the need for democratic policing?
So the theme of a lot of your papers was, isn't this an idiotic idea that people all want all this aggressive policing? If you invite the people to weigh in, they're going to weigh in, and the world's going to look terrible. And so I'm going to address that along with this in particular, which is, let's start with, the world does not look so good right now. I mean, you know, you need to explain to me that the world's going to look less good than it looks now. And I don't believe that to be the case. I think, as you all know, if those, I don't know which chapters folks read or were assigned.
Well, you told me.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. I guess everything with the last two. So yeah. I don't think very highly of judges. I mean, you got to decide things somehow in a society. I don't think very highly of judges. They've done an absolutely appalling job. I'm happy to tell virtually every judge I meet how appalling a job they've done. We do live in a democracy. We should at least start by requiring there to be democratic mechanisms for decision-making. As Evan will tell you, all democratic decision-making methods are not majoritarian. Administrative agencies don't take popular votes. They operate on the principle of rationality. And so I do not believe that policing would look worse if we did it by majority vote or by other democratic means with some caveats. One of which is if you ask people if they want to be safe, they will tell you yes, and they want everything conceivable to happen to be safe. But that's the wrong question. That's decision-making at wholesale as opposed to decision-making at retail, which is, do you want to stop 1.4 million people over a small number of years when mostly nothing is getting turned up? That's the level at which the conversation ought to occur. I'll also just say, so one of my most fundamental goals of the policing project, which I actually feel like we're getting there, it's going to actually happen, is to have police and communities sitting around a table and have the community express their deep dread of the violence with which they are living on a daily basis, and have the police say, okay, well, but you don't like stop and frisk, so you don't like the violence, but you don't like what we're doing about it, and I want to be in the room and be able to say to the community, do you have any other ideas of what it is the police should be doing? And I suspect that people will have lots of other ideas. We seized on one thing. It became a theory of policing. Let's just jack up as many people as we can. We don't see evidence. There's very little study in this area. The social science is shocking. It's appalling how little there is. Don't see much evidence that it's working. And I'm not sure who's in favor of stop and frisk. I'm not sure it's the people in the affected communities where the stopping and frisking is happening. I do understand that Jeff Sessions and the President of the United States think there should be more stop and frisk, but, with all due respect, they just don't know very much about it.
What do you think of the broken windows theory? What's is there empirical stuff on that you?
There's a little bit. Again, not a lot. There are a few studies.
So broken windows theory is the idea that when the community sees it, do you talk about it in the book? Is it in the book? I read about it recently, so maybe
I don't talk about it a lot in the book.
If you see a broken window and it doesn't get repaired, that encourages everybody in the community to think there's lawlessness in the community, and then you get more lawlessness. And so by going after misdemeanors and other lesser crimes, you actually have a positive effect on bigger crimes, which is not stop and frisk. It's taking misdemeanors seriously.
Yeah, and it's complicated. So there's not a lot of empirics, and the empirics that there are actually don't suggest that zero tolerance or broken windows policing helps very much with crime. But that may be the wrong question, quite frankly. So I didn't live in New York in the bad old days, but you talked to lots of people who did, and it was not a safe place, and everything was covered in graffiti, and you were swamped by squeegee guys whenever you drove your car down the street. And people are
It was awful. I actually, every time I flew into New York on business, I felt like I was flying into a third world country, and felt like I had, for example, had to move my wallet from my back pocket to my front pocket as soon as I got off the plane. It's just the way it felt.
And people are, society is entitled to decide that it wants to live in an orderly way. I couldn't agree with that more. I like to feel safe. People who read some of my work and think, though I don't think a lot of people think this, and I spend my days working with police who don't think this, but that I'm anti-police in some way. I'm way pro-police. I'm way pro-safety. And I think that to the extent that anybody, and many people have, framed the narrative in this country as though we're either pro or anti-cop, whether it's like there's half of the country that doesn't want to be safe. It's the most ridiculous thing on the planet Earth ever. We all want to be safe, and we all want to live in an orderly society. And the question is how you get there in a way that's respectful of people's rights. And again, in many of the communities in which we work, which I refer to as the affected communities, there are many residents that want a lot more order. The question is how you get there, and that's hard. It's a hard job, and what's really hard is being a cop that's stuck arbitrating that. So I've got a student who's reading, it's fascinating, he's reading the transcripts of all of the community meetings that get held in Chicago by the police board, where community members will come and complain about things. And there are folks, old ladies who live with the drum guys outside. So I'm assuming what's going on is that they're bunch of guys that have, empty plastic containers and they're doing drum routines. And, they deserve to go have their fun in some way, and she deserves to be able to go to sleep at night. And Deborah Livingston has written a lot about the difficulties of, community caretaking and community policing. It's tough. And, one thing I'm deeply sympathetic to, and I think Christy is as well, her dad was a cop, is that, police have gotten trapped in a horribly difficult place in this society. We've thrown all society's problems to the police and asked them to fix them. And we haven't given them any skill set to do it. So, of course stuff goes wrong, and I don't have easy answers to all of that, but I do think that we can create a process by which we come to answers to questions like that.
Forrest, you want to follow up?
Sure, yeah. So in light of historically there was wide resistance to community policing efforts, which were probably, the people wanted one major police reform. After the war on drugs, it would be community policing. Is there really hope for serious dialogue between police and citizens to reform police tactics, given the kind of failure of community policing to really take hold in the United States?
So I think there's two things in what you just said, and it's not clear to me that they're connected, but I'm not sure. Community policing has never properly taken hold. Do you disagree with that? Do you think that's wrong?
Properly taking hold. Depends on what you mean by community policing and properly.
So I think what keeps happening with community policing is that we talk about it and part of the department gets assigned to do it, but it's not real policing. So then you have the real police and you have the community police. And I think community policing needs to be an ethic for the department. It's a way to police that's top down, bottom up. It's what we do. And I don't think we've ever done that and given it a fair chance to succeed. In part because it keeps getting interrupted by this militaristic threat of policing that, lets us have wars on drugs as though we're, occupied by our police departments. War on terror, which is, again, I think serious. I don't know that that's how that connects to the community talking with the police, but maybe it does. So no, go ahead.
I view it more, I guess you'd say it's more of a failure to implement the programs, where I'm saying it's more police resistance is what's causing this, why they're just, with these 5 people in this community policing group, and we've done our minimum, and now we're going to go back to being the thick blue line and doing what we normally do just to satisfy people, but they're not really engaging, they're not really 100% into it.
So, trying to change policing is not for the faint-hearted, and it's not going to happen quickly. And yet I have to say that I constantly remain hopeful. So with all the work that we're doing, if I'm candid, I'd say we're at the beginning of it all. We've gotten ourselves enmeshed in a variety of communities around the country. Tampa, and Tucson, and Camden, and Chicago, Nashville, we're just starting. And the optimist in me thinks, it's funny, I enjoy this very much, but there's something that makes me very uncomfortable about this conversation, and I'm going to be honest about what it is. It's Christy. And it's because Christy has lived so much of her life in a position to know that though I've spent a lot of my life trying to be an expert, I feel like there's an uber expert in the room, and so I may say stupid things, so you should just stop me if I am.
Just go.
But what'd you say?
I should just leave.
I don't want you to leave. Never leave. So we just had a meeting in Chicago to talk about a community policing plan, community engagement plan. And it was some top brass from the CPD, somebody from the mayor's office, and a number of individuals from the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, so the advocates, activist community. And I sat in that meeting, as I sit in many meetings, stressed out and very tense and quiet, and just hoping that things don't go off the rails and trying to interject when it seems like it will be helpful. And it was a great meeting. And after the meeting broke up, people were in different parts of the room, and I was kind of circulating. And everybody was saying, that was a great meeting. wow, we talked to each other, we actually got along and agreed on some stuff. And the maudlin optimist in me believes people actually like each other and want to like each other. They just have to get to know each other as people, and that's hard. We run a youth program where we work with kids and cops to try to solve a problem together, and we begin by having them interview each other to understand that people share common life aspirations and desires and fears. And so that's the happy story that I can tell you, which is and I think my sense from, and I deal with more progressive police chiefs rather than fewer, or rather than less progressive, is they want people to think they're doing a good job. And so if they can sit around at a table with the community and hear what the community wants and give it a try, and it seems like it's okay, it's win-win. But there's a deep strain of policing that's extremely militaristic and has an incredibly different perspective on all of this. And that's a cultural problem that is just so deep and going to be so hard to fix it. It's going to take, a generation to fix it. We have to think about we have a proposal we're working with the Leadership Conference and the Police Foundation to try to get funded called Reimagining Public Safety, in which we want to have a national conversation about reimagining public safety without path abandons. Let's just let's just think about it. What would a safe community look like? And who would the people be that would help it be safe? There'd be a lot more psychologists and social workers than there are armed people running around. And what should uniforms look like? And all kinds of questions like that. But we've had a hiring model and a way of what policing looks like. And there are lots of folks that, and I get it, I was a kid once too, I'd like to run around with my guns and whatnot. And think it's a lot of fun running around in body armor with cool weapons and doing all that military stuff. And, that's hard to fix.
Dennis, you're not so optimistic about the police. You want to share what you said in your paper with the rest of the class? Barry's already read it, but everybody else.
Yeah. So my paper, I talked about the blue wall of silence that they mentioned in the book, where basically cops cover for cops regardless of the acts that are committed, sort of we have to take care of our own mentality. But I think that blue wall of silence sort of extends further than just the police force, and it extends to the courts, the legislators, so the government in general. And then I also said that the media participates in the blue wall of silence, and just individuals who aren't even part of law enforcement or the government. And for a lot of the same reasons that you mentioned in the book, as far as the legislators and the courts, mainly because they're all part of the same system. So the powers, in my mind, the powers that be don't want to usurp that sort of structure that they already have going. But then I mentioned the media, because if you think about when police officers kill an unarmed black man, you see countless examples of, oh, he had, weed in his system, he was wearing a hoodie. They start getting all these different sort of character traits about that individual. He has a past arrest record, basically just trying to denigrate his character as if there was a reason that he was killed or that it was okay for him to be killed. So I think that's a problem. But then also I talked about sort of just ordinary individuals such as like the Blue Lives Matter movement, which I think is just absolute horse stuff. Because I think that it rose in a response to the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of what you were saying earlier, Professor Friedman, about it seems that you have to either be pro-police or anti-police, when in all actuality, the Black Lives Matter movement, at least my participation within the movement, is that it's pro-police reform. There's just all these different examples, and for most of them, it actually reached the mainstream as far as the killing of unarmed individuals. Their character traits were the same. There's a black man who, even if he was committing a crime, that's what the court system is for. That's what, innocent until proven guilty, and at least allow him to have his day in court. But to kill someone before they even had that opportunity based on a perceived threat, and most times than not, the person who was doing the killing was a white male. So that's sort of where the Black Lives Matter movement sprung from. But then you have people saying, well, Blue Lives Matter, and then it just becomes this whole thing where now we're trying to justify what the police do because of that. And I think I actually go through it in my criminal, I'm about to finish too, but I go through it in my criminal procedure class. We're going through the Fourth Amendment, like the exclusionary rule and stuff now. One of my classmates, her husband is a police officer, and I actually know her, and I know that every time I say something, I feel like she's defending her husband. She's not necessarily defending the actions of the police officers, and I think that's also contributes to the problem. So much so that I even start kind of skirting my opinions on what I really feel because I don't want to hurt her feelings because I know her, and now, so now I'm trying to tiptoe around the actual issue. So I say all that to say, democratic policing is a great idea. You would, in the perfect world, get everyone's opinions on how they would like to be policed, but I think it's going to be difficult when you run into that blue veil, especially, as you said, they're like very organized, and oftentimes opposition to them aren't as organized.
Yeah, so, I think the first thing I want to say is, again, very personal. So doing the work that we're doing has affected me profoundly as a person. And what I've noticed that it's done is it's created, I have much more empathy than I had 4 years ago. And I have it for everybody involved in these struggles. I didn't spend a lot of my life in very poor minority communities, and I didn't spend a lot of my life with police officers. And I have a lot more empathy for everyone involved at this point. I mean, again, I'm not going to say this in a lot of very public gatherings, but I sit in meetings now and find myself often at the verge of tears, and I just have to keep it together because, and I'm sure Christy's had this experience, I mean, you just listen to people's experiences and it's really painful, but you gotta kind of play a professional role, and so I just, like me crying would probably be the wrong response, or maybe it would be the right response, I don't know. We need to be creative in ways that we're not. So, this is nowhere in the book, but I've come to believe that one of the big problems in policing is that there isn't much in the way of a clear advancement track for good officers. There aren't enough incentives for good officers. There are policing organizations or organizations that run on a lot of sticks and I think insufficient carrots, and I don't know how to fix that. I don't know what what those things would be. One idea I've had is that it's interesting. You get mobility around the country of police chiefs, police leaders. You don't get much mobility of police officers. We don't have a system set up where, I'm in Bridgeport and I'm kind of sick of Bridgeport and I'd like to go Sarasota, I don't know, anywhere. And to get hired there, they're actually going to care what kind of cop I was. We don't even have very good metrics, frankly, about the kinds of things that this is a huge problem. I was on a long call today about metrics, which is, everybody will tell you cops do what you measure. So if you measure arrests, they're going to arrest a lot of people. If you measure stops, they're going to stop a lot of people. But so now are we going to measure how many times they smiled at people? That's hard to measure. So I think the solutions to the kinds of problems that we have require creativity. They require us setting up a set of metrics for what it is we want out of police and being able to adhere to those metrics. And I think we need to find incentives for officers that will cause them to want to be good cops who speak up when bad things happen. But I don't have any easy answers to that. I think this cultural problem is one of the biggest.
Christy, do you have any reactions to this, what Dennis was saying?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. First, I should say that Barry should not be nervous that I'm here, right? And I learn something every time I hear Barry talk, which is why I'm here today. And the great thing is that we share a very similar approach to this. I think the empathy point is something that I really feel I have. My father was a police officer. His brother spent a lot of time in and out of jail. They were teenagers, and thank goodness it was a different time, and they were able to go on and live their lives. But I've been able to see as a child, how different sides of the story. I think that empathy, and I think that, the experiences with people who have different relationships with these factors is actually really important. And that's sort of my reaction to this is, one of the things I like about Barry is his absolute, heart honestly, outrage at what the police do. At the same time, his absolute belief that the police are good and we as a society are good and we can make it better, right? Because what's odd is that the more I've done this work, the more I've come to believe that same thing instead of, and I get furious sometimes with the things that I see police officers do. But you do learn that there are a lot of people who, if given permission to do the right thing, will do the right thing on both sides of the issue. And the trick is trying to find that. And what I have one of the things I find so fascinating about Barry's work is that it is true. In talking about the fact that we need to take this away from judges to some extent, and that in the hands of the people, he's recognizing that we're never going to solve policing by just focusing on the police. We have to focus on a much broader set of players. But what is also true is that when we do that, the reality is that quite often, more often than not, people are making rules that will be applied to other people. And that's the crux of the problem, whether you're talking about Ferguson or anywhere else, right? It's like, I'm going to make up these laws knowing that that's not applying me, it's going to apply to somebody else, which is why I think you get very different.
Be clear for me, I'm like, it's just, which people are making rules for which people?
So, for example, when you're talking, it's less of a problem when we're talking about things like surveillance or drones. Everybody, people have cell phones, people can imagine that these rules will be applied to them, and they tend to want to curtail the government much more. But when you're talking about stops, or arrests for misdemeanors, or drug laws, that people don't think about that applying to them, even if they're, if they've got a little pot in their bag. Like, they're not thinking about it. They're thinking it's going to work in these neighborhoods to these people. Most of the people are mostly poor people. And so I don't think that, and so I think it's hard. I think that's the challenge to what you're talking about, right? It's if people were actually thinking about how they and their family members would be affected by these rules, I think we would come up with some much different rules, which is why it's very important to go to what you call the affected communities, and find out what their ideas are, because we've been there, we've asked them those questions, and there are some really good ideas. But for whatever reason, and it may be everything from, voting rights issues to felony disenfranchisement to people are irresponsible, don't want to vote, whatever your reasons for thinking that people don't have a voice in that, they don't. And so they're not, the people who are making the rules aren't listening to those ideas. So I think that's the challenge when you're going to talk about. There's no question that to solve policing we have to get it across to people to do it. But the challenge is getting the people who are making the rules to care about who they're going to be applied to, or finding a voice for people who are going to have those rules.
Dennis?
I agree wholeheartedly, and I think a perfect example of that is like the crack epidemic versus the opioid crisis. And when you think about a lot of the same issues that are sort of the undergirds to these different movements, you have one where, there's armed distance length between the actual communities that are being affected and the legislator or lawmakers. So they're not handling it a certain type of way, but then when the shoe is flipped and, now it's hitting a little bit closer to home, you can see how the whole sort of just conversation has changed. And I think what also is difficult too is I 100% think that the opioid crisis should be handled the way it's being handled. I think it is a national crisis. In the same way that I thought, I wasn't alive then, but reading about the crack epidemic, I would have wanted that to be handled. But I think it's the same thing when it comes to sort of policing. Like, I do think that there are communities where there is a lot of crime based on certain sort of aspects that are there. I mean, there are jobs, there are programs. Even myself, like when I was kind of coming up, there weren't after school programs for me to participate in, so it made sense, not made sense, but I drifted a little bit further to the left. But then once we got into a different school system and there were those programs, I was able to flourish. So I think that that's the other kind of part of this too. Like, people don't really, when it's not hitting home for them, they don't understand those issues because, well, this is what I've done, so it can't be that bad for anyone else. And I think that's just another aspect of it. So I'm not anti-police, I just think.
I just want to respond to the blue veil idea that the police stick together and propose that this is a more general phenomenon. It's not limited to the police. When I was a prosecutor, one of my good friends, in fact, he was a groomsman at my wedding, who I was sworn into office at the same day. After we were in the office for 2 years together, he started hanging out with lawyers who I knew to be corrupt lawyers that would, pay off judges and stuff. And I cautioned him against it. And then he went out into private practice and he started hanging out with them some more. And I cautioned him against it. And he kept saying he was poo-pooing it. He says they're not so bad, they're not so bad. And then I just sort of stopped going out. We used to go to games together, so I used to stop calling him, and then he stopped calling me. And so we just didn't sort of had a falling out. We never had a fight, but we just stopped seeing each other. And then after I was a law professor, this was a couple of years later, my first year of teaching, I got a call from a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times asking me about this guy because at least a month or two earlier, it had been revealed that there was an undercover investigation of corruption in the Circuit Court of Cook County that was run by the feds. And she had gotten, who I knew from when I was prosecutor, she had gotten the information and confirmed that my friend Terry Haig was a mole. In fact, he had become an undercover FBI agent to ferret out corruption in the Circuit Court of Cook County. And so so I thought, oh my gosh, yes, of course, it has to be Terry. I mean, actually an hour earlier, a former partner of mine in the DA's office had called me to say, we're all over here trying to figure out who the mole was, because there was a leak that there was a mole. And his first thing he says, well, if it was you, partner, you'd tell me, right? Because apparently I was a suspect for who the mole might be. And I said, well, it wasn't me. He said, well, what about Terry? I said, of course, it has to be Terry. I mean, that explains everything. He was a Boy Scout, and now he turned into a corrupt lawyer? I mean, what are you talking about? So anyway, he ended up going on to testify against all these judges, and they put them all, judges and cops and clerks, they all went to jail. It was great, because all the judges I knew to be crooked, most of the judges I knew to be crooked, and some, including one that fixed a case out from under me, got sent to the penitentiary, so I was having a field day. But here's the thing. Much to my surprise, lawyers who were my role models, lawyers, not cops, lawyers who were my role models thought that Terry had acted wrongly, that Terry was a snitch, that he was a rat. And, when I didn't talk to them that much about it, but when I had an opportunity to talk, and these were people who I really respected, my senior to me, and in private practice, they were prosecutors when I first knew them. By the time this was happening, they were all defense attorneys. And he said, and I said to him, wait a second, you can't call him a rat or a snitch. He was an undercover agent for the FBI. He wasn't a criminal ratting out another criminal. He was investigating. Didn't matter. And because there is this closing of ranks. And I think, and unions do it to, slackers that are within the union. They might not like it, but they're not going to let management or whoever else is going to do anything about it. You see the teachers' unions with the bad teachers as opposed to the good teachers, every group. So I don't know if it's that pervasive, if it's that fundamental to human nature, how whatever reforms you're going to do, you're going to have to do with that as a given. If your reforms require that aspect of human nature to change, that tribal nature we have to change, you're not going to get your reforms done. Your reforms have to take that as given and then deal with it, like Madison was trying to take some of our worst features as given and then deal with it. Chrissy?
I mean, I think that's so completely right, and I think it underscores how difficult it is to be a police officer and how we need to recognize, when you think about what we do in those situations, and support officers, get people in there who have an extraordinary commitment to ethics, right? Who are like the kind of people who are going to say, I would turn that guy in, right? And then develop the policies and the training that build that, because it is absolutely human nature, everybody in every profession does have that, but it's particularly important in policing. I think it's important in all professions, but it is particularly important in policing given mistakes. And it's more difficult in policing because, unlike lawyers, they have to rely on these colleagues literally for their lives, perhaps, right? And that's going through their minds when they're thinking about whether to become a rat or a snitch, right? it could be a matter of life or death for them, not just, no one good, I can't drink with. So I think, but that is why you really have to focus on the systems and not sort of bad apples idea, right? Because you're getting it way too late if you're just waiting for people to go wrong and then go after them. I wrote an article with John Barrett, who's a partner here at Shepherd the Monitor in New Orleans, about a program they're doing there on active bystandership. It's called EPIC, Ethical Policing is Courageous. It's similar, but it's built on these ideas of like everything from Mothers Against Drunk Driving to anti-bullying campaigns, where you're actually teaching officers to intervene when they're on the scene, teaching them the words to say, hey, why don't you step back, why don't you let me handle this? So, rather than ratting on someone afterwards, they're actually teaching them that those are not things, given human nature, and given that a lot of people become police officers are 20-something years old and they're, they don't often have a lot of life experience, they're not going to come up, they're not all, some of them amazingly will, but they're not all going to come up with that on their own. So it just really points, I think, to the need to really focus on the systems and supports and not just think, well, they should have been able to do better and they didn't, so now we're going to send them off to jail for not doing better.
So who's up next? There were other hands, I was overlooking them. James?
I'm going to change topics a little bit. So I think I really enjoyed the book. I really appreciated your candid review of appreciating what the police do, and also, I think, at least to me, it seemed like a pretty accurate portrayal of the facts as they are. But it also seems to me that if this whole thing's going to work, you seem to be asking for more upfront rules without sufficiently coming up with a way of having a back-end enforcement for it. So for me, there's a lot of problems with the judges, and I agree with that they have effectively chewed away the Fourth Amendment. But the problem to me would seem that that's a problem with the exclusionary rule, that if the judges enforce the Fourth Amendment, well, then police would get warrants. The problem is that they're not. And it didn't seem sufficient to me to say that the way to solve it is to just have the police, or rather judges, exclude more evidence by preventing unauthorized police action in. That's just putting more pressure on an already struggling branch of the government to do what we want them to do, which is stop bad police action.
I followed every bit of that except the very end, which is about.
So I think what I'm criticizing is the unauthorized rule just seems to ask the judges to exclude more evidence from court. And they already can't do that when there's a rights violation. So why would they do it when it's just unauthorized action?
So, first I just want to make a general comment about the relationship between the front end and the back end, which is going to seem extremely obvious to you, but I think people don't think through it. So I was looking to see if there was a whiteboard or a blackboard, but I'm going to just describe what I would write if I was writing.
I think it's
okay, I can describe it. Which is just, if you think front end, back end,
This is the new Georgetown. We have whiteboards here.
I may not have pens.
So it's supposed to be a feedback loop. And that's really important. So a lot of people are outraged that officers shoot people and nothing seems to happen. But it's hard to hold somebody responsible under the Graham versus Connor test, which is, objectively reasonable at that moment. And if you had, instead, a set of detailed rules of things officers should have done or not done, then it is easier on the back end to see whether something went wrong. The back end is important because when you see problems on the back end, then you can fashion new rules to try to fix them on the front end. And so, in general, I think you need this feedback loop to make it all work, and that is important, and we're missing half of it. And so people don't think the back end is very efficacious, but of course it's not very efficacious. The rules aren't very clear up front, and the back end has done a bad job of highlighting the problems, whereas if we had a set of rules that they could start to play against, we'd be better off. I'm ambivalent about the exclusionary rule, which means that I feel strongly in two opposing directions. Part of me just views it as an imperative. So we were having this whole conversation about the blue code, how clans protect one another. So corruption is the government lying in court, the government lying under oath. That's corruption. That's the essence of corruption for me. If the government can't take a witness stand and tell the truth, then we just are in trouble. And I get why it's a problem, because cops figure they're after bad guys, and they know that there are these rules, and they got to say some stuff to get the bad guys. And as I remind my very liberally tilted NYU law students, there are bad people in the world, and we want them to be brought to book. And the idea that you can break fundamental rules in society and then just admit the evidence, la-di-da, like nothing happened, outrages me. But on the other hand, as Randy and I and Evan were talking last night, the exclusionary rule has this self-defeating quality to it. And Randy had a proposal in his youth to try to fix it. Others have had proposals to try to fix it. They're all complicated and difficult. I think we should continue working on cracking that nut. But the other thing I will happily say to any judge you put in front of me is, you get paid to do a job, do it. Or just find another line of work. Because if you can't it's like the whole rule of law thing. I have so little patience for judges at this point in my very long legal career. This is one of the most interesting things to me, is that I came into the law, a law believer, a judge believer, and here I am 30-some years later, and I've lost all patience, and I'm disgusted, and I hope I get opportunities in life to explain to judges why they're arrogant and don't think hard enough about things and lord over people and don't do the job that they've been assigned. Because I feel like one of the few privileges of age is that you actually get to speak your mind and tell people what you think you've learned over all those years, and I would like to do that.
I came into the law through the Circuit Court of Cook County, so it's all been Now, before we run out of time, there's a number of students who pushed back on the suspicionless search proposal, which we haven't touched upon at all. That is a real change of topic. I know Jesse was one. I don't know who else is. Well, Jesse, James, we haven't heard from you. Why don't you articulate this?
So I guess it came from the fact I thought it was somewhat odd that the solution to the presence of some suspicionless searches, which seemed sort of on their face to violate at least the core idea of the Fourth Amendment, that the solution was to search everybody. And I understand that it seemed like part of the reason behind that was that would increase democratic pressures to control the suspicion of those searches, but it's difficult for me to see how it gets past the Fourth Amendment, at least as far as written rule, and it seems sort of against the principle as well.
And
So I'm kind of an originalist.
Before you answer, Jesse, you want to add anything, and anybody else? We'll just get it all in one question.
Yeah, well, I thought that it seems like by focusing on arbitrariness as the core thing that the Fourth Amendment is protecting against, you're excluding any concern about the level of intrusion into people's lives. While I'm open to that being actually the meaning of the Fourth Amendment, it seems like the text, just by using the word reasonable, would have a broader scope than just arbitrary application. And by focusing on arbitrariness, it seems that you could ultimately justify a police state so long as the government intrusion into people's lives is equally distributed or randomly distributed.
Anyone else on this topic? Alex?
Yeah, and I will sort of add in the concern that I have about the democratic pressures sort of pushing back against this with something that Christy actually talked about, which is this sense among people, I think when it comes to law enforcement, especially of certain laws, like drug laws, that it's never going to affect me, it's never going to be an issue for me. What do I care if everybody gets tested? What do I care if that's a constitutional intrusion? Because it's not going to happen to me. So that was one of the issues that I had with democratic pressures, is that you see people sign away their rights all the time and sign away the rights of other people all the time. And so if you're relying on the political process to hold police accountable constitutionally for these searches, I think you're going to see a lot of policies that are democratically chosen, but probably unconstitutional, or at least constitutionally concerning.
And Simone?
Yeah, just add in, one of the things that I found most jarring about.
Just pile it on.
Yeah, I'm sure it's helpful. But you had so convinced me of your argument about the Fourth Amendment and general searches that I sort of just found myself feeling whiplash when you were saying that, you know, having these suspicionless searches, and if, as long as it applies to everyone, that's fine. I just really felt those two things, that the first argument you delivered so convincingly really was just conflicting with that whole portion of the book.
Okay, there you go.
What time do we finish?
I'm gonna let you go at 5:15, so you can make your
Okay.
turn.
I can even pull it to 5:20. So obviously.
No, you gotta go at 5:15.
You were thinking, and you're thinking it's going to take me 35 minutes to try to explain this. Okay, so I have friends who are originalists. But I'm about to prove that I'm an originalist. Who think, you know, the evil is general warrants. You can't just search everybody. And I always have two words for them. Airport security. I can't get my head around the idea that, you know, airport security is unconstitutional. And even though I don't think it, you know, I think it's a pain in my butt, and I don't think it's as effective as it should be, I feel a little bit better getting on those airplanes knowing somebody's trying to figure out if there are people carrying guns and bombs onto them. I remember 9/11 all too vividly. But then you have a problem. I mean, this is the problem when I teach this stuff in class. It's like, you know, we're about to get there right now. We've gone through the warrant, you know, per se unreasonable if you don't have a warrant, and so if it's a search, you've got to have a warrant and probable cause, and now I'm about to go into class and say, airport security. Like, how does that fit? It doesn't fit. You got a problem. And the Supreme Court's just been trying to figure out the answer to this problem, and they're making a mess of it, and I don't blame them. It's complicated, and they haven't kind of had the insight, and we hope to do some litigating around this and push them in the right direction. I'm a fellow traveler of originalists. So it turns out that the framers of the Constitution didn't like general warrants, but they definitely thought it was perfectly fine that every single ship that sailed into port would have a customs officer get on the ship and ask for the manifest and compare what was on the manifest to what was in the hold, and if not, you were in trouble. And there was no cause associated with that.
Can I interrupt for a second? Because one of the things that Marshall refers to in Gibbons is health laws of every inspection and health laws of every description. But I don't know how they were enforced. Do you know how they were enforced?
No, but I do know about the ships.
Right, I know. The ships are a good example. I thought maybe it went beyond that too.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Like quarantines,
Inspection laws.
Yeah. Inspection laws. Okay, so I do know that, which is if you wanted to run a distillery, which, you know, you did out of your house, you had to designate which part was going to be the distillery, and then you had to tell the government how much alcohol you had in there to start with. And then the inspectors would just come around to the distilleries, just like they conduct administrative searches today, and they'd check and make sure that you were paying the taxes on the alcohol that you were producing. And that's how we kept the government up and running. I just described two of the important ways that we kept the government up and running at the founding prior to the ratification of the Fourth Amendment, so it ain't crazy and it ain't anti-originalist. Now, let's talk about some of the practical stuff. So, I actually, with all due respect, think you're wrong. We don't have universal DNA testing because people don't want to give their DNA over to the government. We actually are happy to have arrestees, which I think is crazy, as you know from the book. And consistent with something people were saying here about, you know, what comes down on other people versus what comes down on me, we're starting to get a lot more democratic policing around surveillance and drones and, you know, more well-to-do people's problems. And so I actually think that when people think it's going to happen to them, and you mashed up two things, but I think what you were saying, I want to make sure I'm clear, was like it will happen to them if it's happening to everyone. They just don't think they have anything to hide. So people say that to me all the time. I don't have anything to hide. I don't care. You know what I say? Let me have your email password. Nah, maybe not. You know, and there's this great story about Justice Scalia. He went to talk at some law school, and he was very much, though he was very much partisan of the Fourth Amendment in many ways, he didn't think there were problems with things like trash searches. So the students all tried to figure out everything they could find about him on the internet. And then they confronted him with all this information, and he was pissed off. He thought it was a terrible invasion of his privacy. So I don't have anything to hide. I'm not engaging in any criminal activity. I've sent intimate notes to my wife that I don't want other people to read, and to my children. I've trashed some people that I'd rather them not know about. I mean, we all live in a zone of privacy, or, because somebody raised this in their comments, security. I actually don't fall, so I think privacy is the wrong word. The word in the Fourth Amendment is security. The right of the people to be secure from the government. And I think we all have that right. But so then you have a tension, which is we want to conduct these searches. They seem essential. But then how do we do it in a way that there's a safeguard? How do we avoid arbitrariness? And I think there's two ways. One is we do it to everyone. And I think the pattern of what we allow law enforcement to do will look differently if we do that. The other is we bring in the equal protection clause, which just gets lost here completely. Which is if we're going to do it to some folks and not others, this is where the whole, like, when I teach con law, it looks one way, and when I teach criminal procedure, it looks just the opposite. In con law, it ain't complicated. If you're going to engage in a violation of, or arguably something that's governed by the Bill of Rights, sorry about calling it the Bill of Rights, a fundamental right, natural right, of some people and not others, then you need an empirical basis for doing it to those folks and not the others. And you also need to show that the problem is sufficiently serious in that group that you ought to do it to everybody in that group. And a lot of BS in Supreme Court cases like, oh, let's just drug test student athletes. Or my favorite, Vernonia versus Acton, which is, let's just randomly drug test all the students in after-school activities, the 4-H club and the school chorus, with no evidence that there's a drug problem or that these are the people responsible for it, is outrageous. And so I think, that's the doctrinal construct that makes sense to me in this world of this new rule of policing in which we're all in some sense suspects because it's regulatory in nature. Having said that, if any or all of you have better suggestions for what the doctrine should look like, you should email them to me because we're going to try to do some litigating around this, and it's a hard issue. Evan really wants to talk.
Yeah, so I have a front-end question.
I don't know if I'm allowed to call.
Well, that's apparently that he can't be stopped. Right.
So you refer at several points in your book to cost-benefit analysis, and you focus on the fact that most law enforcement policies aren't subject to cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis can mean roughly a couple of different things. It can mean just kind of generally weighing the pros and cons of a policy, or it can mean a sophisticated decision procedure whereby surveys are sent to people and they are asked to tell the surveyors how much they would be willing to pay or willing to accept, avoiding something horrible happening to them, whether it's emphysema or leukemia, or even in the context of the DOJ study that was done several years ago, avoiding prison rape. It is very controversial. There are mensurability issues that have been raised around it, distributional issues raised around it, assumptions about the ability of human beings to predict how they would feel about particular things in the future if something happens to them, raised about it. And my question to you, well, a couple of questions. One, which kind of cost-benefit analysis are you thinking about? Two, if you wanted to operationalize the second kind, how would you do it? And how would you monitor it being done?
So we are doing it. The Arnold Foundation funded first a conference among methodologists who do CBA in the environmental area and health sciences and other places to talk about how to apply it to policing, and we have a report that will be coming out shortly to talk about the possibilities but also the challenges, and you put your finger on. That's called contingent valuation, and it's very complicated to do, and there's a lot of debate about its reliability. And then we partnered with the Police Foundation to do kind of back of the envelope CVAs, which we're doing pursuit policy in Roanoke, de-escalation training in Asheville, ShotSpotter in St. Louis County, crime analytics labs in Houston. And we are about to do a full-scale CBA of proactive traffic stops in Nashville, Tennessee. And we are going to assemble a top-notch team of social scientists, and we're going to do our best. 3 pinprick things I'll say. First, if you decide that you're going to implement a system of widespread stop and frisk, and you want to figure out whether it makes sense, then you want to have some sense of how many bad guys you're going to get, what are the crimes that you're going to avoid, and how you would value those crimes. We have some data on those things. But you'd want to include the cost to the communities and to the individuals of being stopped and frisked, and I'm relatively confident that the number is not 0. So if the number is not 0, then you have to value it somehow. And then it gets super hard, but you have to try. Second, I actually think the most valuable thing that's going to come out of this project that we're doing now, Evan, isn't that. And I sympathize with the difficulties, that's the third thing I want to say about the project. It's that we're going to develop templates to help police departments, like decision matrices, just so that when they're sitting around in the command room talking about an idea, let's use drones, let's do this. It's like, let's help you think through the costs, the benefits, the unintended consequences in a rough way. The first kind that you're talking about. Because I actually just think, we're all mission, and police are super mission oriented, and they maybe just haven't always stopped and thought about all that stuff. Let me tell you, in Seattle, they'd have been real happy to have done that before they decided to buy their drones, because there was a political outrage that happened in Seattle with, crazy meetings where, citizens are calling public officials Nazis and everybody's out of control. And it's like, wow, maybe we should have just thought through this and thought about whether we should ask somebody. The third part, the second kind, though, is really hard. And it's going to be a big challenge, I think, to get accurate valuation, without a doubt. We could have long conversations about it. I spent most of my summer reading about cost-benefit analysis and contingent valuation, and that's actually what I'm writing about right now. But when folks started to do this in the environmental area, the pro-environment, anti-environment, that's I don't believe that one either, but those two groups were so far apart on the value of human life. But over time, the methodology improved and people converged. Still may not be right. I actually look at some of the numbers and wonder. But you make an improvement. And so, there's a part of me that's just, I know the Enlightenment is over now, but there's a part of me that still believes in kind of science and trying to learn a little bit more by tackling hard problems. And so,
the Enlightenment is over?
I think so. Looks like it to me from Twitter.
I didn't read Twitter today. So
Just always.
I missed that. We have only about 20 minutes to go, so I want to give the people who haven't spoken an opportunity to. Sam?
Given that a lot of your prescriptions are for more democratic oversight,
Does that extend to direct democracy or elections? Like, did you look into whether police departments and jurisdictions that have like sheriff's elections or people at the top are any different from if they're appointed?
Well, they tend to be worse. But you know, you can't, that's hard to say because you have to control for demographics. I mean, sheriffs tend to be in rural places, you know. Chiefs are appointed in urban places. I think it's a mistake to read the book and think that what I'm saying is that we should have direct democracy around everything, especially choosing police chiefs. I don't. I'm a big fan of counter-majoritarian procedures. And in fact, one of the really fascinating things that's going on that I think I could say what I'm about to say publicly. So there's a group in Chicago called the GAP, the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, and they've been charged with drafting an ordinance for a citizen-led, sometimes people say civilian-led, I hate that word, civilian, police department. And it's this incredibly elaborate, organized group of grassroots neighborhood organizations who are doing this. And their level of organization and vetting of ideas and community meetings and the executive directors meeting, like, it's super impressive. It's slow, but it's super impressive. And they've crushed all of the issues now except how to select a commission. And they're having this big fight among them because there's this innate sense that we should elect the commission. And, you know a little bit about elections in the city of Chicago, and I know less, but I know enough about, and I've also just thought to look at what demographics look like.
I had to patrol the polls when I was just on election day. That was fun.
We've worked hard to suggest alternative methods of selection to elections. So I appreciate an intervention from Evan last night about, where he pointed out that democracy does not mean direct elections all the time. It means accountability in certain ways to the public, that their voices are heard, that we respect those voices and respond to the things that people are suggesting. I don't have an answer to what's the right model to govern policing. My co-author in an article that I wrote called Democratic Policing, Maria Pomerenko, was actually writing her job talk paper about this question of what are the right communities to be making decisions about what kinds of policing decisions. We're experimenting all over the country with everything from notice and comment rulemaking, which we did in New York around the NYPD's body camera policy, and in LA about when to release footage after officer-involved shootings, to we've just stood up a community advisory council in Tucson. We're working with GAP on this ordinance. We're trying to take civilian review boards, which are back-end agencies, and teach them how to do front-end work. Don't have the model for you yet, but I think it's going to be an intricate model that manages to just give the community voice and to bring together two questions that we often keep separate, which is what do we do about crime and how do we want to be policed? And they're the same question.
We've got a little more than 15 minutes. We have 4 more students who haven't said anything, if by my count. So there's Drew, there's Caroline, there's Andrew, and Jason. So let's go Drew. I saw Drew's hand first, then we'll go to Caroline.
Well, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed your book as well.
So you gotta be a little more succinct.
I got the message.
My question is about, I guess, front-end rules as well. And you, Professor, brought up third world countries, and I actually lived in one for just under 2 years, and I realized that to one extent, I really actually felt safer there. And I think the main reason that I felt safer was because I didn't feel like I was being surveilled constantly over the internet and the technology. And so I guess at that point I thought, well, I wish it was like that everywhere, where people couldn't just have access to the things that even though I guess I voluntarily, and you kind of touched on this as well, voluntarily joined some of these online communities or put, I have information that's on the internet. But recently I was able to see, I guess, a defendant who was accused of a homicide who was able to get a not guilty verdict based off of
self-defense, and that was because of, I guess, hacking or searching, if you will, his the decedent's online Instagram posts and whatnot, and finding that he did in fact have a weapon that he probably used in that occasion. And I guess to me it just kind of validates that if I were making rules, I would make like strong rules, and then I would riddle them with exceptions, like some of the justices have done. And I guess my question to you is, to what extent do you see, to what extent would you see that being the outcome, even of democratic rulemaking, and what procedures maybe would you put in place to safeguard against, from a long list of rules, but then a long list of exceptions that still folks don't know?
Yes. You know, the ALI project that we're working on is kind of an experiment to doing that. It's principles and not rules. And by the way, I didn't answer Jesse's question fully about the invasiveness of procedures under a reasonableness analysis. But in our ALI principles on encounters, which we're about to release to the advisors, we have an invasiveness principle. So we say the degree of invasiveness matters as well. You know, you just got to try to draft rules. I mean, that's what our students do now. We have them working on drafting different kinds of rules. And sometimes you need a standard, sometimes you need a rule. Sometimes the rule is intricate, sometimes it's simple. I tend to believe generally that paramilitary organizations run best on clear rules. But you know, just got to sit down and try to write the rules. But I've never done much of that. I've never done much of legislative drafting. I don't know if you have, but it's kind of
I've tried to draft constitutional amendments, and it's much more difficult than you imagine. If you are trying to actually draft an amendment and know what you're trying to prevent, and then not let that language be the very vehicle by which they can get around what you're trying to prevent, it's just really hard to do.
It's hard to do.
Caroline?
Also is on the rulemaking theme. I think the book does a really good job of establishing the incentive structures for all parties and sort of help establish how we got where we are. And notice and comment as one of the solutions stood out to me as being something that would entrench those incentive structures rather than address them. Two of which being that legislators don't want to legislate on this issue because it's not helpful in terms of re-election, should be seen as weak on crime, and that courts defer frequently to what law enforcement has done because often the person standing in front of them isn't actually the guilty party. And if implementing something like notice and comment that allows legislatures to delegate, and that gives courts a system that they have consistently deferred within. And I just wonder how that works, and hearing that you've done it, I'm very curious sort of how you get around those issues.
I think I told the story last night, but we did this notice and comment around the NYPD's body camera policy, and we got 30,000 questionnaires from 50 organizations submitted comments, and we wrote a big report on what the public thought the policy should look like. And the NYPD changed some of it, but they didn't change some pretty fundamental things, and a lot of the civil rights groups are really angry and said bad things about me and the idea of democratic policing. Maria Ponomarenko and I wrote an op-ed that said, you know, there's different forms of democracy. We could have had a vote, and then the NYPD could do everything that we said by vote, or we could do notice and comment rulemaking, and then their obligation is to explain why they did what they did. And they did that. They wrote a very elaborate report that explained in great detail why they made the decisions that they made. I thought it was fundamentally wrong in some particulars. I will reveal here that we had some conversations behind the scenes that were not pleasant. But so yeah, I mean, first of all, in every bit of this conversation, I want to recur to Winston Churchill about democracy because, you know, it's what we got. I think the real worry in what you've said, and I got this in several of the comments, was, okay, but if we do this, aren't courts going to defer more? And I get that. That's a worry. Of course, there's, you know, like with notice and comment, there's basic requirements of rationality that would have to be met. So I don't know if courts would defer more. I don't know if courts really could defer more. I mean, I do view the situation as so bad that almost anything could be better.
Jason?
Yeah, these whittling away of Fourth Amendment protections by judges, it seems like a lot of that is due to not just a reasonableness analysis, but several sort of sub-analyses involving reasonableness all throughout, whether a warrant is required, whether to use probable cause, and even did a search actually occur. And I thought you presented a lot of pretty much bright line rules as far as this will be easier if we just require a warrant, but require probable cause. When it came to whether or not a search occurred, you seem to stick pretty closely to Cat's reasonable expectation of privacy. And I'm just wondering, could you envision or do you think it would even be preferable to have more of a bright line rule to figure out whether a search occurred?
I appreciate that. You know, those two chapters on that and the third-party doctrine are just really were hard for me. I mean, if you read the third-party doctrine chapter and you got that far, I throw up my hands a bit at the end. I don't have a simple answer. In the way I want more theories. I don't know. It might have been your comment. Somebody's comment said, you know, like, why isn't it a search if people try to keep things private? Was that you? Somebody said that here. Somebody said it. I thought it was a good idea. I thought it was a good idea. I mean, it's like
the article I sent you by me.
Maybe it was your, yes. It was that's right. Somebody in here had a good idea, and I know who it was.
So let me just restate for the class what the basic point I was making in this very short piece. I sent it to you, actually, but I don't think they've read it. And that is that, you know, the way that searches become, the logic of physical searches and property protection is that you close the door on your house, and to cross the threshold into a closed house, you have to get a warrant. In the virtual world, there are ways in which we close the door on our virtual information. The most obvious way is by password protecting it. Having password protected it, that is, I mean, I don't like cats, I don't like the reasonable, I don't like limiting to physical property either. But the reasonable expectation of privacy standard has become circular, as has been pointed out by many other people. Because what you have reasonable expectation to privacy about will depend on what people are going to be doing to you, and if they're starting to do it to you, then you don't have a great expectation anymore, and that's what's circular about it. But the idea here is that when you take steps to keep your information private as opposed to not, so you close, in one of the examples in your book, you close the blinds on your window, the drapes, you don't keep them open. Close the drapes. You don't keep them up. If you keep them open, and people can look, if people can reasonably look in, then they're open. But if you close them, they can't look in. At that point, whatever technology it requires to overcome what it is you did, they need a warrant to employ that technology because now they're intruding. There is a bright line rule. I realize there are times in which you might want to go in, and we have administrative. You know, there might be other things going on, but at least there is a threshold matter that extends. And I think in my article it was it the dissenting opinion in Katz, or there was a concurring opinion in Katz?
So Katz actually doesn't.
Okay, Katz is the concurring opinion, right? It's
right,
the majority opinion.
Yes.
It's the majority opinion in Katz that was doing something like this.
So somebody says about Katz, and I've never found the quote. Like I read RA's looking, because I quoted it in the book, and I have to take it out, or maybe I just say it. Figure if I can't find the quote, I'll just say it. But the Katz was an enigmatic opinion because it's hard to find a rule in Katz, but what the court says in Katz is one who goes into a phone booth and closes the door justifiably relies on the privacy that's been accorded,
even though it's a glass door. And so, and I that's
what
what
about
I
a
say.
lip reader?
Right,
That's
and that's what I say in my paper. So there you go. There's your.
And I think that's, you know, I mean, I think social convention does define what privacy we think we have, but I like Randy's paper a lot, and you know, the case that drives me insane is Serralo, which is, you know, the Serralos were engaged in agricultural pursuits in their backyard, and they had built a 6-foot and a 10-foot fence around
Well,
it.
I thought of my paper when I read that.
And you know, the Chief Justice, literally, Berger, writes in his opinion, well, yes, okay, people from the street, but anybody on a double-decker bus could have. And I went and looked to see whether there had ever been a double-decker bus that anybody mentioned in the internet in, you know, that part of California. No. And the idea that, like, okay, they did that, but now the police can, like, rent an airplane and fly over. I mean, Again, and it's not saying that they can't do it, it's just saying that they have to have a judge say that there's a reason to do it before,
It doesn't that they can't do it, they have to have a warrant.
get a warrant.
Get a warrant.
That's right, get a warrant.
Like Joe Biden said, get a shotgun, get a warrant. Andrew, you're the last questioner.
Yeah.
Before we may have somebody else, but you're the
I just heard you addressed all the main issues I had, but like I said, just be interested in hearing your thoughts on achieving that accountability. You're like going outside of like the context we have now, like I don't know, like small scale experiments with like, privatization. In the context of how that would, you know, have market forces hold the police accountable versus rules that are broken or changed.
Yeah, I don't have much faith in market forces. I have faith in, money damage remedies, though I think there are lots of problems with those. It's weird because we're running all these experiments right now, and it's a ton of work. We spend more time concluding that what we're doing just can't really be the answer because nobody's going to do this much work to run a police department. So, that's the bad news about what we do. And there are 18,000 police departments, so, or we don't even know around that. And so I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but what I do think would be cool is if our thinking about it, I mean, that's why I wrote the book, right? And you know what? I don't run into many people, even when I just do like the elevator speech, cops, So here's what you do. You go to a police department and you go out to the division or the precinct or whatever, and usually it's a bunch of men, not all white, usually larger than I am, staring at me like this as I talk. And they're used to getting people to talk, so they don't betray much of anything, and you're just talking. And you just do this whole thing about front end and back end accountability, and you're just thinking, I just want to shoot myself right now. And I have never had the experience of having anything other than the following occur, which is that there comes a moment where the person in charge in that row says, that isn't crazy. That's interesting. That's something to think about. And I think, so I'll come back to where we started about writing books and being a scholar and all that. I feel like whatever the life force is out there that you want to believe in, it gave me one really good idea in my life. And it's this idea that just like, wow, this is so weird. Why don't we have democratic accountability in policing? And I hope the idea catches on. Like, I'm not sure what the form is going to look like, and it's hard to do. But I'd love people to just start to think, like, hey, we ought to have a voice. And it is kind of happening. I won't attribute it to my book. I actually attribute it to policing getting invasive and for, well-to-do people. Where they're going like, whoa, we need a privacy board, because who said you could just put all of our faces into a facial recognition database? Like, oh, I'm a respectable person. And so, that that's my hope, is that people just start to think the way we've been doing it doesn't quite make sense, and we ought to try to start doing it this way.
That's a great note on which to end this class. Thank you very much for coming.